and over to Louise and Adam.
Thank you, Claire. So I'm delivering the first part of this session. My name's Louise Peacock. I'm subject lead in drama, and my colleague Adam is program lead in drama. And between us, we have years of experience of teaching clowning, stand-up comedy, burlesque, cabaret, and all of these forms have their roots in or are closely connected to radicalism, to thinking outside of the box, to colliding ideas that don't usually belong together. And we've seen the liberating effect that this can have on students' thinking. And so we began to consider how the tools and exercises that we use might help us address two key questions. If we can have the next slide. And these are the two key questions that we're going to try and answer today. How can dynamic and creative performance strategies employed by stand-up comedians enable teachers to challenge students in ways that enhance their learning experience? And how can games and exercises used by comics to generate material be used by students in ways that challenge, inspire, and motivate new ways of thinking? So behind the first question sits the assumption that there are connections between stand-up comedy and teaching, which I'm going to explore more explicitly in a minute. And you'll notice that the first of our two questions focuses specifically on lecturer or teacher behaviour. What can we do? How can we draw on those strategies to shift the way that we behave in the classroom, hopefully to enhance the student's experience? The second question explores the notion that the games and exercises we use to teach the popular performance forms that I already referenced can be used beyond those specific classes to inspire students approaching other material and concepts which may have nothing to do with performance and which may have nothing to do with generating comedy. Next slide, please. So this is the structure of the session that we're going to take you through today. I'm going to talk about the disruptive pedagogic potential of stand-up, and I'm going to try to identify the connections between stand-up comedy and teaching, why we think those two things are a fairly good match. And then we are going to get you involved. Now, if I was in the room with you, I might sense a kind of shiver of apprehension at this point when you see that we're going to get you involved. But don't worry, it's nothing too threatening, right, Ads?
Well, it might be a useful opportunity for people to put on the clown noses and the funny hats that we asked them to bring. Is that a good time?
Yeah, that'd be a great time to do that.
But if everyone could do that, that would be great. So you'll be ready for what's happening next.
Yeah, I should think we've sufficiently increased the level of fear now. And then Ads is going to take us through some games and exercises used to generate stand-up material, how we use them in the classroom, and how you might use them. So next slide, please. In his book, Getting the Joke, Oliver Double suggests that comedy is disruptive of normal thought processes. And whilst it might feel risky to encourage students to think differently, it can pay dividends very often when we introduce students to new material. We want them to see things in a new light. We want them to mould new ideas. Much of the humour in stand-up comedy arises from incongruity, from the creation of an expectation which is raised and then in some way subverted or redirected. And the recognition of that incongruity can be pleasurable. It signals to us that there is more than one way of looking at things. And for students, that idea that there is more than one way of looking at things is very important. How often do we hear students asking us for the right answer when we want to encourage them to consider that there may be multiple right answers? When we teach clowning, we encourage students to embrace failure and incompetence. We use exercises that set them up to experience failure, that provide opportunities for them to be incompetent. They don't always like them to start with. They find them challenging and scary. But when they come out the other side of those experiences, they report feeling braver, more confident, more inclined to take risks. So the exercises that we use specifically in the classroom have a lasting effect beyond the classroom. Next slide, please. So we're interested in the disruptive potential of the games and exercises that we use. How can playing with the unexpected encourage the students to be more creative, to hold stronger positions, to develop clearer attitudes and thoughts? We want the exercises to challenge the students in the moment, but we also hope that the exercises will begin to shift the way that they think outside of the classroom. We want them to feel readier to challenge each other, to challenge what they read, even to challenge us. For example, just in terms of disrupting normal patterns of thought, one exercise that I use is a warm-up exercise called a rule of three. Rule of three is very common in comedy, so the students get used to working in groups of three. And this warm-up exercise requires two students to work together, and the first student names two items that are readily connected. So they might say apples, bananas, and we all recognise that they kind of belong in a set together. And the other student then has to provide a third item which doesn't fit. So we might have apples, bananas, circular saw. But the intention is not necessarily to be funny, but just to start thinking about incongruity, about the possibility of providing unexpected answers that might draw a response. It also sets up the idea of the possibility of multiple right answers. Like, as long as the third item isn't another fruit, the students can say pretty much anything. So they do have that kind of safety of just knowing that it's hard to be wrong. Another exercise that we use is to ask the students to list 5 topics they feel strongly about. And then they have to talk about one of those topics, and this encourages them to emphasize and even exaggerate their opinions. And so that's developing skills in holding a strong attitude and even being prepared to take potentially unpopular positions about their chosen topics. Although we normally start with relatively harmless topics, so things that they particularly like and things that they particularly dislike. So the stakes are small. They don't feel like they're taking too big a risk. Next slide, Ads. So I said that I would talk about the connections between stand-up comedy and teaching, and I'm going to focus on 4 particular areas of what takes place in a stand-up comedy performance that we think overlaps significantly with what happens in a teaching space. So one of the things that we do is to use direct address. And all that means is that we are talking directly to our students in the same way that a stand-up comedian is talking directly to his or her audience. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily cracking jokes, although we might use humour in the way that we address our students. Sometimes I will tell a joke, even a poor one, because a groan from the students is a sign of life. It's a sign that they're still listening to what I'm saying. The stand-up or the lecturer is responsible for the shape and content of what will be said. They are in a position of power relative to their audience. So using direct address simply means that we can speak directly to our audience, and we can use our comments, our lecture, to do a number of things at the same time. We might want to educate. We want to keep our students engaged. We want to encourage a flow of energy backwards and forwards between us and our audience. It's not uncommon to hear teachers and lecturers liken lecturing and teaching to a form of performance. And we think that the closest form of performance is stand-up. Just like the stand-up comedian, the lecturer must operate in the here and now. And what I mean by that is, whilst the material that we're delivering may, indeed should, have been carefully prepared beforehand, we deliver in real time. and we have to respond to the cues and responses our audience, our students, are giving us. Double suggests that a stand-up is bound to respond to a heckler, and a stand-up might well comment on late arrivals. So too, we have to respond to the things that we see going on in the classroom around us. So we will respond to questions, we respond to comments. Maybe we stray from our lecture to talk about late arrivals, and maybe if a student gets up and leaves the room to use the bathroom, we might throw out a comment about that. And all of those comments anchor us and the students in the same time and space, and they also demonstrate that we're reading the room. And most teachers will do this instinctively in the same way that stand-up comedians do. We're judging the extent to which our audience is with us, how they're responding. Are they unified or divided? What can you do with that unity or division? I've seen that something's come up in the chat, and I'll respond to that in a second. Otherwise, I'll lose where I'm going. We have to pay attention to what the students are doing. If we see that they look confused, we need to be able to pick that up and respond to it. The final element that I've got on this slide is persona or personality. What that really refers, in stand-up comedy, that can refer to a whole spectrum of things, all the way through from just appearing as yourself to putting on a full character. I'm not suggesting that when we're teaching, we develop entirely different characters to our normal everyday ones, but we are probably all aware of turning up the volume on ourselves a little bit, trying to be more engaging, generating enthusiasm, even when we might not actually feel it ourselves, but knowing that if we don't generate it, the students might not generate it for us. And so we turn up the sound on ourselves, we brighten our colours. We know that part of our job is to generate the energy in the room. I'm just going to have a look at something came in on the chat.
It's probably something that I can pick up on in the next slide, Louise. I think it kind of feeds, I think it's a comment from Bev that feeds directly into what we're going to be talking now about what you've just outlined and the way in which there's an equivalent for them on synchronous teams teaching.
Right, because I've been talking about what's going on in the live environment, and you're about to move on to talk about how that might function on Teams. So I will hand over to you, Ads, and I'll keep an eye on the chat in case anything else comes up.
I'm just trying to sort out the slides. Where have they all gone? There we go. So as a little summary of some of the ideas that Louise has just outlined there, I want to feed those into a kind of a broader discussion to get people elsewhere in the session involved in thinking about the extent to which there are equivalents of these ideas when we're teaching synchronously online via Teams or Blackboard Collaborate or some other means. So we're focusing specifically here on synchronous online learning. If we're thinking about a direct address, acknowledging the presence of the students in front of us and speaking to them directly will be something, as Louisa said, that we're all familiar with. In a classroom, it's straightforward, just as it is in a comedy club. You look out, there they are. You can see them, they can see you. If you raise your voice just a little bit, turn up the volume a touch, or use the comedian's microphone, you can hear them, they can hear you too. How many of us have found this more difficult when trying to speak to a class of students online? How many of us have found that we're not entirely sure who we're talking to, or have started to wonder if there's anybody there at all? What techniques have you discovered? This is what we want to find out at this stage. What techniques have you discovered? By all means, put these into the chat to replicate that kind of direct address that Louise has just introduced as an idea. She also introduced this idea of the here and now, and being present in the here and now, letting the comedy audience know that you've seen the bloke in the front row go to the loo for the second time in quick succession, weaving that into the act, getting a laugh by checking to make sure that he's washed his hands. Comics and compares invariably work in the present moment. It's part of what makes the event special, unique. Kevin McCarran and Maggie Sabin-Bardin, who have done quite a lot of work on this interrelationship between teaching and comedy. They suggest that when lecturers allow themselves to put down the script that they prepared for a moment and respond to the students in front of them, respond to their questions, their comments, their observations, and allow those contributions to set the agenda for the class, teachers find that both they and the students find the experience incredibly rewarding. How easy is that on Teams, though? Has anyone here found an equivalent to that kind of free exchange of ideas that you'll get in a comedy club and you get in an invigorating, galvanizing class? We talked about reading the room. And how easy is it to read a room when that room is virtual? When it is, in fact, 30 rooms or more, with each containing a lone student who may or may not have on their camera or their microphone or even their pajamas. Comics know when the joke has landed. They know when some sections of the crowd get it and others don't, and they react accordingly. Stuart Lee does this hilariously, celebrating those who laugh when he reaches the punchline of an intricate and subtle story, and berating those who haven't put in the intellectual effort required to appreciate the joke. Teachers working in the present moment are keenly aware also when the room isn't understanding the work, or when some groups are and others are not. Is anybody here really confident about this with teaching a class in the digital environment? And what are the kind of techniques that you're using to respond to students who aren't quite following? Persona and personality is an interesting one on Teams. Who here's finding that they need to draw on different aspects of their personality when teaching online? I think I am. In a face-to-face practical workshop, my natural tendency is to be unremittingly Tiggerish, to bounce from one group to the next, modelling the kind of energy and dynamism I'm hoping to see in their work, pouncing on interesting comments and questions. Affirm, affirm, affirm. I'm struggling with that. I have to say, I'm struggling with that persona in Teams. It seems too big. I'm not convinced that the students have the energy for it. So how are you finding your teaching persona changes, if you've thought at all about your teaching persona? So before we move on to look at some of these games and exercises that Louise and I have used in our classes, this is the opportunity now to take a moment to hear from you about your experiences, and giving you an opportunity to respond to these ideas that are on the slide now about direct address on Teams or the equivalent, about the here and now or the equivalent, about reading a room, about persona and personality or the equivalent. So it's over to you for some comments and questions. It's always difficult for me to see the kind of questions that are coming. Are you able to? What kind of responses are you able to see?
So there's a comment coming from Jerry saying, I tend to combine a sense of humour and a healthy dose of sarcasm. It's a man after my own heart. Not sure if it's the best way to go. Okay, so using humour, using sarcasm as a tool to try to engage the students.
And how effective are you finding? Was that Jerry? How effective are you finding that, Jerry? Are students responding positively to your sarcasm or not? Is that a typical approach that you would use in the classroom that translates to working on Teams, or is it something that you found that you had to adopt? That's an interesting question for me, I think.
Yeah, and there's a comment from Bev, which I'll come back to in a moment, but Leanne has come in on the sarcasm question to say that it can fall flat with international students. So any suggestions about dealing with that? And I think that does kind of connect, doesn't it? Adds with this notion of reading a room, you know, that sometimes we try things and then we realise it's not working. So if you have a lot of international students and that kind of humour isn't working, you're probably going to try it and then adjust.
Yeah, or maybe even it's not humour at all. Maybe it's just ideas, concepts, terminology needs much more careful unpicking for students whose first language isn't English, which you won't know necessarily unless you're able to see perhaps some blank expressions or perhaps some kind of drifting off, looking out the window or whatever.
Yeah, and there's a comment. There are a couple of comments from Bev. One I think that really connects with the notion of here and now. She says, I acknowledge I'm in my house, so reference that my kids may come wandering in, which is very definitely a here and now technique. And she also says that she runs a Menti poll to take the temperature of the group at the start and then tell them how she's feeling too. So I think that's a kind of technological version of direct address, another way of engaging the students and getting some feedback from them.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's Sarah or Sarah, so my apologies if I'm not getting that right, but I definitely call on students individually when the tumbleweed starts and reinforce attempts at engagement with positivity, even if the answer's wrong. Right, and sometimes we all do that even when we don't feel very enthusiastic or encouraging about what the student said, but we recognise that we better kind of keep them engaged and we don't want to close off any conversation. And somebody, I saw it pop up. Okay, I've got a couple of comments. So Barry says it seems more important than ever to ad-lib. Using blank slides, whiteboard and Blackboard Collaborate for students to write on when invited can catalyse more responses due to anonymity. It can be a gamble, but setting boundaries usually helps manage this. Also, a non-session related intro activity as a warm-up can give an impression of how engaged students are. And Darren says, and Barry agrees with him, regular use of emojis from students through the session to signal that they're still alive, online and okay. So technological versions of the clues, that the signs that we would be reading in the live classroom.
Yeah. I like the idea. I'm happy with the idea of students using emojis. I'm not so keen on using them myself. I always feel like a real old man when I try to use an emoji. It doesn't just sit well with me, but I'm more than happy for students to do it. Louise, I'm wondering if we should perhaps move on, given the time. Yeah. We can keep the questions coming in, the responses coming in, but we'll move on to the next bit, if that's all right with everybody else, which is starting to look at some games and exercises that I've used in various modules, but I'm focusing particularly on the most recent use of a particular game called the furniture game. The furniture game is something I'm sure anyone who's been involved with primary school or teaching poetry or English language at primary school in particular, seems particularly popular at primary school, would have come across. But it's, as it says there, it's a really simple game. That's why it's useful. That's why it's quite easy and accessible for students. But it requires the writer to describe people in relation to objects or items of clothing, types of weather, times of the day, animals, birds, types of food. As you can see in the example there, they've used dogs and chocolate. Where's the next one? There we go. So Simon Armitage took the furniture game to new heights in recent years with his poem "Not the Furniture Game." There's a quotation from Simon Armitage's "Not the Furniture Game" there. I used it in a third year module that focuses on cabaret and its associated forms, burlesque, stand-up comedy, those kinds of things, and uses those forms to explore political performance and the political dimensions of performance. And we use this exercise specifically to help students spice up and clarify some monologues or pieces of performance poetry, satirical writing that they were generating. So I used the game as a model for performance texts because it forces students, this goes back to what Louise was saying earlier, it forces students to think creatively, concisely, eloquently, and perhaps in ways that they aren't used to. But it also demands that they adopt a clear attitude to the subject. And attitude is something that is written throughout any kind of study of stand-up comedy and comic performance. So the kind of dessert you use to describe Boris Johnson, for example, or the animal you choose when writing a satirical poem about the way young men behave in nightclubs, is going to depend on your attitude to the subject. Students have to think about who they are and the relationship they have with the rest of the world. They had to do so creatively, and we quickly found that they naturally did so comedically. And this was particularly the case when we started to include afterthoughts. So in the previous examples of metaphors produced using the furniture game, the writer's attitude to the subject was implied without being spelled out clearly. Describing someone's eyes as chocolate minstrels gives you a sense of the writer's attitude to the subject without spelling it out particularly. Asking the students to introduce the metaphor and then explain it with a pithy afterthought led to the creation of a really simple joke structure with a setup. If Boris Johnson was a dessert, he'd be a trifle, and an afterthought or a punchline, thick, sickly, soaked in sherry. So the first draft of the jokes, as you might get from this example, the first draft of the jokes weren't always particularly effective. And that also became quite clear in peer review, with other students picking over the jokes that the other students had presented them with. It made it very clear that the initial attempts weren't particularly effective, and it led to some interesting discussions about why the jokes hadn't landed. Was the afterthought a continuation of the initial thought? If it was, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But if it was, maybe it was too wordy. Maybe it was insufficiently concise. So it got us thinking about the technicalities of joke writing, but it also forced us to think more carefully about the subject. Is the Prime Minister actually partial to a sherry, or is it just a convenient way to respond to the task? Does it just look good on paper? Your attitude towards the Prime Minister is clear through this joke, but is this the best image to articulate it? Might there be a better metaphor to describe Boris Johnson? So this kind of criticality and this kind of flowing of ideas between me and between the students and between students, this kind of criticality led to an experiment that required students now familiar with the furniture game to use it as a means to construct jokes in response to some preparatory reading. The most recent example required them to read about alternative cabaret and alternative comedy emerging in the UK in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Having read the two articles I gave them each of the students had to write at least 3 simple jokes, and there are examples here, that likened alternative cabaret or alternative comedy to a well-known person, object or phenomenon, and to be prepared to share those jokes in the next class. So here again, the responses led to some really useful discussions of the reading. Why did alternative comedians tend to favour left-wing politics? Were they actually scared of the right? Or is that another example of a punchline that looked good on paper but wasn't really grounded in the truth? What were they scared of? Were they actually scared of Thatcher, or was it was it fear at all? Was alternative cabaret intimate? To whom or what was it hostile? Traditional comedians may have been prone to sexism, yeah, but was alternative comedy entirely free of sexism? Were women comics welcomed and supported? Or is that just a kind of a popular memory? What about black comics or Asian comics? Did the movement provide them with the same opportunities as it afforded white males? The jokes writing the jokes forced students to adopt an attitude to what they were reading and to think carefully about how to articulate it. And with that in mind, it's your turn to do something similar. So I'm hoping Louise has been busily placing you into some breakout rooms. So we want you to go into these breakout rooms and respond to an attitude. We're not expecting you to write your own jokes, just like that. What we would like you to do is experiment with attitudes in ways that comedians and students of performance comedy do. So there's a whole range of games that are designed to help would-be comics identify their attitude, and to explore the comic potential of that attitude. And this is a variation on one of those games, and it's informed by an article written by Kevin McCarran, again I referred to it earlier, and Maggie Savin-Barden, about similarities between teaching and comparing an evening of comedy. I'm going to see if I can upload that now. So everybody, I'm hoping, should be able to see that. Is that visible, Louise?
I can see it.
Okay. And it might be something that you can type into the chat so that people in the breakout rooms can see it. So, as I say, this is from a larger article looking at the similarities between comic comparing and teaching. So much of the paper is given over to exploring what the writers refer to as strategies of omission. And one of the aspects of teaching practice they encourage teachers to omit is preparation, or at the very least, over-preparing. So in your breakout rooms, this is what we'd like you to look at. We'd like you to take it in turns to respond to this quotation from the text, and to do so by adopting one of a number of attitudes. Okay, and to share your thoughts, to share your feelings, and to share this attitude that you've adopted with the other people in the room. So you might talk excitedly about the ideas outlined in the text. Or you might talk angrily about the ideas, or you might adopt an attitude of extreme boredom or utter contempt. Your actual opinion to what is written here, your actual opinion is of no consequence right now. What you need to do is fully embrace and explore an extreme attitude. So there's no point in being slightly bored or slightly enthusiastic. Go for it fully. Embrace an extreme attitude and see whether it opens your eyes to ideas you might not have considered before. And I think we're going to give you about 5 or 10 minutes to do that before we get you back into the main room. Are we ready to do that now, Louise? Are we in a position to do that?
You can raise your hand and put your mic on, or put something in the chat about how you experienced that exercise and whether you think it might offer you anything in terms of helping students to respond differently to material that you give them. So I'll just let that sit for a second.
So I can talk a little bit about what it was like in room 1.
Thank you.
There are some radical thinkers in room 1, I have to say, and some very emphatic thought processes going on. In fact, John and Heather were all set, and I think probably are all set to leave this session and take to the streets in favour of banning any kind of preparation for any kind of class going
Wonderful.
Forward. And demanding that it is enshrined in the university regulations, because it won't just make for a better learning experience, it will make for a better world. I'm kind of minded to agree with them, if I'm honest.
Yeah, and Heather is saying in the chat that she thinks it's useful to see and think about different perspectives, and John's agreeing that they were very good at acting that way. Bev says she thinks it was interesting in lots of different ways, not just in the exercise, but we experienced breakout rooms and tasks from a student perspective. And I know, thanks Bev, that was important to Ads and I in planning the session, that we could use that kind of experience. Comments are flooding in now faster than I can deal with. Barry said he was very struck by how uncomfortable he felt in a small group of people he doesn't know. Big increase in anxiety, followed by big increase in empathy with students, right? It's really interesting when we're put in the positions that we routinely put our students in. And in session 3, Claire said that they talked about what we could learn from the students. So I think we have 2 minutes left, Ad. So I thank you, everybody, for experiencing that for us and for reflecting on your experiences. So some conclusions. Claire says that they started acting like students as well, quiet, cameras off until they got going. Right. And we've been experiencing that in this session. You know, we throw out questions and there's a pause. We do fall into those roles, I think, quite easily, and it helps us to understand how it might feel for the students. Jerry says it was definitely out of his comfort zone. Essentially, he'd tend to utilise different questioning techniques to reflect on the topic. Right, and so we're just offering this as a possibility. Ads, would you like to take us through the conclusions, or do you want me to do that?
Well, I can, yeah. So we set out at the start of this paper to explore strategies used by stand-up comics and the potential applications in the classroom, potential applications that can challenge both teachers and students in ways that enhance the overall learning experience. And I'm hoping that by taking you through some of those exercises that we've actually achieved. Oh, my computer seems to have started a scan. Oh, sorry about that. I'm hoping that you would agree that we've achieved that in some way, just by giving you one or two examples of the kind of games and exercises that we share with our students and require our students to participate in. What we also set out to do was think about the equivalent strategy. So as Bev immediately identified before we'd even moved away from the second or third slides, is we all find ourselves in an online digital environment, and that was one of the things that we were keen to explore. We didn't have answers for the way in which these ideas might be. The application seemed okay, it seemed reasonable to us for face-to-face teaching. We were less clear because we are far less experienced at teaching online in the digital environment, and that was one of the things we were hoping to get some thoughts and ideas from you from. And I think we have, Louise, haven't we?
Yeah, I'm just responding to a comment in the chat as well, because Darren's talking about the importance of the tasks being very well defined for the participants to find the value. So I think that keys in as well to the way, not only what the games and exercises are, but how they're set up. Yeah.
So I think the last thing I would say is that the kind of writing jokes, adopting persona, they are directly applicable to classes where we're encouraging students to think about clowning or stand-up comedy or other forms of popular performance. What we're hoping is that you have found that they might also, if they're not directly applicable to you in your subject areas, whether there may be equivalents, whether there may be opportunities for you to think about demanding that students adopt different attitudes, forcing them to adopt a specific attitude, to clarify their own thinking, to clarify their stance and their position, and to argue forcibly for that, to defend that, or to argue against that. So these aren't kind of catch-alls, but we're hoping that if you don't adopt them wholly, that there are some equivalents for you in your subject areas. Louise, is there anything to add to that?
No, I'm just agreeing with Bev is saying that she can see how she would use it to explore critical writing, and I know that you have done that quite a lot, Ads, and that it does. Those kinds of exercises do work well for getting the students to engage differently with critical writing. So the kind of attitudes, writing jokes in response to the material, taking a particular position, all encourage them to engage with critical material in different ways.
Absolutely.
I'm aware that we are slightly over time now, and so we should probably stop.